Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to Fashion Declare's expert panel, How to Reduce Fashion's Water Usage and Pollution. My name's Safia Minney and I'm founder of Fashion Declares. Really delighted to be with you this afternoon. So I'd like to just give you an overview of the agenda. So we have Mark Sumner from Leeds University. We'll be also joined by Lavinia from Germany, Craig, who's with us in London from PANGAIA, Maddy from Greenpeace, who's also in London, and we'll be running through the Q&A towards the end with some closing remarks. So yeah, this is supposed to be very interactive, so please enjoy these really rich presentations.
So we know we face a climate and ecological and social emergency, that the Anthropocene has been brought about by human activity, industrialization, that we have an industrial world that is totally dependent on fossil fuels. And this shows over the last 200 years just how the temperature has increased on the planet. So we know that we need to redesign every sector, not just fashion, but every sector and the industry at large, to fit within, to operate within planetary boundaries, that the 9 planetary boundaries, already 4 of them have been exceeded. That's in terms of the safe levels for climate change, nitrogen and phosphorus loading, which is largely through agriculture. And we know that regenerative farming is one way of beginning to reverse that trend, land conversion and biodiversity loss. So fashion, depending on the report that you read, is responsible for between 2 and 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that if we look back over the last 50 years, despite the many climate conferences, Kyoto, Paris and Glasgow, that we are still heading for 3 degrees of global warming, and that clearly this is incredibly dangerous. So the Human Climate Niche report shows how by 2070 we will be looking at as many as 3 billion people that will be on the move, and this will be due to extreme weather events which will make land uninhabitable, that will also mean that food and water scarcity will impact livelihoods and the living and the living standards of more than 1/3 of the population. So we have an urgent need to act now, and that's why we came together as a community to create Fashion Declares, to bring you this program of webinars and tools to help you to move forward with what you can do within your organizations in the face of the emergency. So the crisis is also unfairly distributed. We know that the global south accounts for only 8% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, and yet is unfairly bearing the brunt of much of the suffering and impact of the global climate and ecological collapse. So 88% of the world's population live in the global south, and 82% are currently bearing the cost of this climate breakdown. So it's incredibly unfair. So we have to, and the fashion industry is a perfect example where the scope 3 or the supply chain side is of course not only a huge impact in terms of exploitation of nature, resources and people, but also an opportunity to redesign so that we can put people and nature back in the driving seat. So 89% of greenhouse gas emissions are generated by fossil fuels. So the big question is how to delink the fashion industry or any fashion or clothing model from fossil fuels. How do we transition away from fossil fuels? We know that 2/3 of fabrics and materials are directly produced from fossil fuels. They're synthetics. We have to cut the production of new by as much as 75 to 95%. please read Kate Fletcher and Matilda Tam's brilliant Earth Logic, which looks at moving away from the growth logic for fashion to an Earth Logic that puts planet and people central.
So the question really that we're holding is, how do we build a regenerative fashion industry? And to the next slide, one that fits within the donut. Many of you will have seen Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, one that fits within the planetary boundaries and that is redistributive and delivers a just transition for all, for those 70 million garment factory workers and farmers within the fashion and textile supply chains. So no small task. I'd like to welcome Maddy from Greenpeace now. Thank you so very much for stepping in. I know that it was very much the detox campaign that got the fashion industry to really seriously move for the first time. So over to you, Maddy.
Hi there, thank you. I basically was involved with the detox campaign from the start as a researcher and also with corporate strategy. And at the moment, I'm working with Greenpeace Germany on their campaigns and also textiles procurement for our own offices. So if you could start with the first slide, I'll just give you some background on detox. Basically, we started with textiles, and why textiles in particular? Because we were looking at water pollution problems around the world, also in the context of chemicals regulation in Europe, known as REACH. And we saw that there'd been a big move from the north to the south of textiles manufacturing and an increase in the use of chemicals. So water pollution is the reason why we focused, and in particular hazardous chemicals, because obviously there are chemicals and textile factories use a lot of chemicals. Not all of them are hazardous, and by hazardous we mean persistent or bioaccumulative or carcinogenic, and there's a whole other long list of what they are. And so we launched the campaign. Before 2011, there was really barely any focus on wastewater discharges and the fact that there might be hazardous chemicals in them. It was basically just legal compliance. The focus was on the final product and what consumers were concerned about putting on next to their skin. And so the detox campaign really changed that, launched in 2011, and the demand to major brands was 0 discharges of hazardous chemicals in wastewater by 2020. So yes, I've already mentioned REACH, and one objective was to try to spread REACH type regulation to different parts of the world, and especially places like China, and to accelerate the implementation in the EU. There are about 3,500 chemicals used in textiles production, and this is called wet processing, and it's where dyes and fabric treatments and washing and bleaching and all of those things take place. And you can see the kind of conditions that we found in the campaign, probably still going on in some places, and the consequences of the huge amounts of wastewater discharges. Compliance with the local laws would not prevent pollution like this. Even if the water looks completely clean and you're not getting coloured rivers, there can still be chemical pollution. Okay, so basically by 2016, we had 80 plus companies committed to detox, from fashion, sportswear, luxury, the multiple retailers, outdoor brands, and suppliers themselves. A large group of suppliers in Italy were part of, made a huge collective commitment and are working to this day on improving everything to do with their chemical use. We reckon that this represented about 15% of the global market. Of course, that's quite difficult to work out because this keeps changing, but lots of large brands were involved. So the core of the detox commitments that they made was that they were really high ambition. So the key to this was really 3 things. First of all, there would be wastewater testing, and that wastewater testing would then be transparent. So they were reported on publicly accessible websites, mainly through IPE, NGO in China, which has a big database, but also by the brands themselves on their own websites. So anybody, whether a civil society or another brand or whoever, could have a look at the wastewater data and see the results. The two other things were very low detection limits and a very wide scope of chemicals. And this was to get around the problem. A lot of companies would do testing and they say, look, our results are completely clean. And then you say, but what were your detection limits? Oh, 1,000 parts per million. And that, for a hazardous chemical, is not clean. So we're looking to bring those limits right down as low as they can technically be achieved. And that's something that we've been working on over the years. They get lower and they get lower. And the scope of chemicals again, they say, oh yes, we've tested for PFCs, and let's have a look at the list, and you'll see they've just got 2 on them. And really you need to be testing a list of, it has to look long. So lots of chemicals that nobody will understand, but it's important to know that they're there and that they're being checked. So yes, that we checked in 2018 with that report Destination Zero, and then we checked again last year, 2021, with this report Fashion Fairy Tale, and we confirmed through that there's a critical mass for change at the high level of ambition that we set up during the campaign. And we did this through an unannounced check. We didn't tell the brands that we were going to be looking at what they were doing, so it was perhaps a little bit more of a realistic assessment, but it did confirm that everybody is still working on it to a greater or lesser extent. And then as a result of that, we also, we've always called on regulators, but we made a big call to regulators to build on the model that was built of corporate supply chain responsibility and the detox process and the supply chain transparency, and to put that into regulation. And you may be aware that there's a ongoing process in the EU which recently announced a textiles strategy, and lots of pieces of legislation are going to come out of this. Things like a digital product passport, for example, and various other elements. Due diligence might come in there somewhere. Yes, you can see that this would be it could be very significant, but obviously everything gets watered down by the companies, and especially chemical industry. You can see on the right, these are the main brands that committed and that were part of the detox commitment. And I should also mention here that the wider landscape, so ZDHC was set up as a result of the detox campaign in 2011. First of all, it was a kind of defense, trying to limit what Greenpeace was calling for. But over the years, it's evolved to a much more progressive and more of an ally to actually implement what the Greenpeace campaign was asking for in the best way that they can. And it's extremely useful because CDHC provides the tools and implementation guidance and workshops and training and all of the things that an organisation like Greenpeace isn't set up to do. So we think this is actually a really good result, but we keep pushing them towards best practice, and everybody else towards best practice, because there's always room for improvements. Urcotec's STEP, for example, goes a bit further than the DDHC. So that's also, we use that as well. And this comes to our own procurement. So in 2011, when we looked at our own textiles, we found that the problem was universal. So it's not only fast fashion brands that are discharging hazardous chemicals, it was organic cotton suppliers and suppliers that Greenpeace was using as well. And so there was a decision then to just suspend our merchandise while this problem was being worked out. And the reason for that, of course, is that all of the chemicals that are used by suppliers are all basically the same kind of range of chemicals from the chemical industry. And we could have gone directly to the chemical industry and told them to clean up their chemicals, but that wouldn't have been very successful. Hence, the detox campaign focused on the wastewater discharges. But it meant that our own merchandise was just as much affected as anybody else's. Alkyl phenols, for example, were just used everywhere at that time. But today they'll be, far less likely to be found. So we did our own pilot project in 2018, and to see whether we could make a t-shirt in a clean way using our supplier in Lithuania. And the results were very good. And as a result, we set up our own standard. And since then, we've been working with suppliers in various parts of the world, 3 in India, 1 in Lithuania, and 3 printers. For the Greenpeace merchandise, we use organic cotton. I think all of it is rain-fed. And also the energy that's used in the manufacturing, at least in some of the factories, is renewable. So that's especially when you're talking about the spinning and knitting and washing and dyeing, that's a major part of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's quite important to factor that in. The other point about water is, in certain parts of India, Tamil Nadu, for example, there is a zero discharge rule. So this is just zero discharge of water. So all water that's used in a factory in Tamil Nadu has to go back into the system. And I think that that's been touched on with the idea of reverse osmosis. But of course, we're looking at, well, if you have hazardous chemicals being used in that kind of system, that could cause a lot of problems. So cleaning up the chemical inputs is the key to sorting that out. And we've worked through with suppliers to do that. We consider this a success with Detox, that we did make a huge change in the industry on chemicals. But it has to be said that the huge amounts of textiles being made and thrown away kind of overriding that. They're eating up the success. And what we're seeing now with the campaign is secondhand clothes and so on being exported to places like Africa. My colleague Viola of Greenpeace Germany, who would normally be giving this kind of talk, would be, she went and visited, and this is a riverbank by the Nairobi River, where water is running straight into the Indian Ocean, carrying probably, plenty of microfibers and also plenty of microplastic fibers, which is really bad news. It's actually a truly shocking situation. So this is
horrendous. So that really brings us back to the point of reducing the overall consumption and production within the industry, doesn't it, Maddy? I'm really, thank you so much, and congratulations for such amazing work at Greenpeace and in really bringing so many brands to develop the pioneering study and work in 2011. It's a long time ago, and we're not there, are we? So I'd like to introduce Mark Sumner from University of Leeds. He came on very, very warm recommendation by Mike Barry, who I think they used to work together at M&S. And really, really delighted that you could join us today, Mark. Could you take us on a journey and we'd love to know firstly how you came into this area of sustainability and textile, and then if you could please present, that'd be marvellous.
Well, thank you very much, Safia. And I'd love to take you on that journey of how I got to where I am now. But in the 7 minutes I've got, that's going to take a long time. It goes back quite a long way. Suffice to say, I've worked in industry. I've also obviously been working in academia, had lots of interaction across a very broad range of sustainability challenges. And water is obviously a really important part of the dialogue, particularly when we start thinking about not just the environmental consequences of water use, water pollution, water extraction, but also thinking about what that means for local communities and societies that are involved in and around the fashion industry. And hopefully today, with the 7 minutes that I'm going to be talking, I can just give that sort of bit of a global context and maybe start to challenge people's views about some of the issues that we see within the fashion industry. So we're just going to get straight into the detail and start thinking about freshwater use across the fashion industry. And of course, when we're talking about this, we need to actually define what we mean by fashion. And what we're looking at here is thinking about the whole value chain for fashion. And value chain being different to supply chain, what we're talking about here is understanding that full life cycle as a linear model as it stands at the moment. And what we can see here is the hotspots of where, on average, the biggest impacts are in terms of water consumption. And it's important to recognise as well, in general, and this is a very generalised view, is the greatest areas of water consumption are most likely to be the greatest areas of water pollution as well. Very general view, but that's generally what we're talking about here. So I haven't got any data or slides around pollution, but work on this idea that high water use will equate to possibly high water pollution. And what we can see here is, looking at that value chain, very clearly we can start to see those hotspots. And what's really interesting about looking at these hotspots is there are certain areas of that value chain that we can just ignore. They're so small, it's not worth thinking about. So for example, retailers, when they talk about reducing their water consumption in their stores and in their warehouses and in their head offices, it's almost a pointless exercise, in the sense that overall, it's such a tiny percentage of the impact. And also within garment making factories, very little water consumption goes on within the garment making factories. So again, it's another area they don't really need to focus on. But very clearly, we can see that there are 3 spikes there in terms of water consumption. And those 3 are really interesting in terms of, the first one is related to the material extraction. Generally, this tends to be man-made generally the water consumption is higher for natural fibres, so things like cotton, and for wool. Polyester production and nylon production don't tend to have a very high water consumption at all. There are other issues obviously associated with those materials. The other thing that we can see is the next biggest hotspot for water consumption is within the coloration process. That whole process where fashion is really, really active around creating the latest colours. And what we can see in terms of that coloration process is it's almost a quarter of the total water consumption associated with the fashion industry. But what's really interesting about looking at the value chain as opposed to just the supply chain is we can also see the very large contribution in terms of water consumption associated with consumers, and how consumers are using their products and how they're caring for their products. So all of us in general are washing our clothes more than we've ever done before. We're also, as a result of washing our clothes more than ever before, using lots of water, but also using lots of energy. And we also are creating pollution in terms of discharge of detergents, and more latterly, lots of evidence talking about microfibres. Interestingly enough, microfibres, I've used the term microfibres, not microplastics, because there are probably far more microfibres of a natural type of material than there are in terms of plastics, based on some of the research we've been doing here at Leeds. But so what we've got here is a picture of the value chain, and now we need to be thinking about, okay, if that's the issue, if those are the hotspots, what can we do to start minimizing some of those impacts? If we go to the next slide, what I'm talking about here is 3 steps that we need to be thinking about. And I didn't really think today I'd be talking about steam traps. They are not very sexy, they are not very exciting, but they are a classic example of, within supply chain and within all areas of that supply chain, there are some really quick wins that factories and brands need to be thinking about in terms of minimizing their environmental footprint in terms of water and also in terms of energy. Steam traps are technically used to dry steam. And we need dry steam to actually drive a lot of the machinery and a lot of the processes within the industry. And if they're not well maintained, they end up leaking an awful lot of water from the system. And equally, we also have this idea of pipes and leakage. You can see, as on the second picture there, lots of water is lost as a result of poor maintenance around all of these industrial processes. And also, very simply, and anyone that has spent any time walking around dye houses, as I've done in the past sort of 20 odd years, you will see taps that are left wide open, gushing water out all over the place. So step 1 in terms of managing our footprint is about looking after each and every drop of water, looking at that maintenance that goes on within the supply chain. And also be thinking about that in our personal lives as well, in terms of what's going on in our homes. But this is step one. And what we're talking about there is potentially somewhere between 10 and maybe 15% of that water footprint, the bit that we can manage. We do need to be thinking about much grander ways of reducing our water footprint. So if you then go to step two and thinking about what can be done there, and here we're talking about massive investments that need to be made in terms of bringing on new technology. Things like looking at proper effluent treatment plants to reduce pollution, but also thinking about not end of pipe solutions, but also thinking about at the wellhead. This is this idea of reducing water and water use and water pollution right at the process itself. So there are processes like cold pad batch dyeing, for example, which really reduce the amount of water that is used within the processes. And we can also be thinking about actually how we can actually build circularity in terms of water use within factories. So looking at reverse osmosis, looking at water recycling, looking at all of those technologies that can be put into factories. But if we go to step three, what we also need to be thinking about, having done all of those sort of mechanical steps, is thinking about the challenges around data and science, and challenging ourselves in some of the myths and some of our preconceptions. So for example, when I look at that map in terms of the value chain, we can see those hotspots. But what's really interesting is actually layering on top of those hotspots water scarcity footprint, because that brings into context the issues that we're facing in terms of water use. And by the way, I just need to highlight the report that I pulled these graphs from, the UN Sustainable and Circularity Report, a really interesting read for anyone interested in sustainability for textiles. And what's really interesting about challenging these myths and challenging our own perceptions, it can be really difficult. So for example, this idea that organic cotton is going to be a better way of managing our water footprint. Actually, there's very little data to support that. And that's not to say that organic cotton isn't good overall. It's about challenging whether the data is out there. And actually, a lot of people who are involved in cotton production, for example, say a lot more can be done in terms of water and reducing water consumption by training farmers to be good farmers. And this isn't about being organic or non-organic. It's about being good farmers and protecting their environment. We also need to be thinking about traceability. What we're talking about here is world averages. And for a brand, for a factory, for anyone involved in this, they need to understand what their full supply chain is, their full value chain is, to identify the hotspots that are associated with those particular areas, because world averages are very misleading in terms of individual supply chains. And it is about context, as I said. We need to understand the context of what we're talking about here, because if we don't understand the context, we actually run into problems in terms of trying to resolve something in terms of water consumption, but actually maybe creating problems in terms of CO2 release. So for example, water treatment plants at factories are really good at reducing water pollution, but are actually also really good at creating CO2. So it's about understanding the context of all of these things. That's the end of my presentation. I think what I might have actually done here, Safia, is confuse people more than educate.
No, that was really that was a really powerful and useful overview, and really helpful to see the value chain broken down into those different areas. So thank you so much, Mark. I'd like to introduce Lavinia. Lavinia worked previously at ARMEDANGLES and is now a sustainability consultant. She has done some really pioneering work. I'm very excited because you're coming to this from a brand perspective. I know that ARMEDANGLES working very dedicated with organic cotton. I'd love you to share your experience and picking up on Mark's point. There is a lot of great practice with organic cotton farming, regenerative farming in terms of drip irrigation and the likes. Tell us a bit about your experience and how you frame, if you like, water and water usage and pollution.
All right. Thank you so much, Safia, and hello, everybody. My name is Lavinia, and I'm very, 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 very honored to be part of this discussion on water management and pollution in the fashion industry with these amazing experts. As Safia already stated, I've been working in the field of sustainability in fashion, implementing ecological and social standard requirements on product and factory level for more than 10 years now. And lately leading the corporate responsibility strategy and activities of Germany's pioneer in ethical fashion, Armed Angels. It's like People Tree, but in Germany, but we were much later than People Tree, basically. Since beginning of this year, I work as a freelance consultant and advocate pushing environmental and social justice understanding in the industry, because I realized that market-based solutions are not enough, and we need a mindset and a system change other than doing cosmetic green reparations on a broken system. And I also learned throughout the years that place dictates strategy, especially when it comes to the responsible management of water. So today, I will talk a little bit about water use and consumption and pollution in the apparel and footwear sector. And I wish to start with a short intro to definitions, because this is where the confusion starts in my experience. So water use, as I have learned it, refers to the total amount of water that has been withdrawn from its source to be used for human activities like industry, household, or irrigation. But water use does not indicate whether water has been lost or gained in a local system. For example, the amount of water drawn from a river by a factory is water usage, but does not reveal if the water used was cleaned and returned to the river in equal proportions. Though, if you see a claim that a certain cotton t-shirt uses a certain amount of water, that's not revealing. And it is no indication that the water was irresponsibly managed or that it took water away from human needs or the environment. Water consumption, on the other hand, refers to the portion of water that is used and not returned to the same system it came from within a short period of time, either through evaporation or incorporating it into a product or moving it from one catchment into another, or the ocean. Agriculture, not just cotton, for example, is a large consumer of water. That's because crops don't just use water, they mostly consume it, as water is not returned to the same system it came from within a short period of time. So in my opinion, water consumption is a more useful term for understanding a product or a sector's impact on available fresh water, since the water is being moved elsewhere or changing into a different and sometimes less usable form. And nevertheless, water consumption is not alone an indicator for responsible or irresponsible water management or environmental impact without additional context, as has already been said in this webinar, about water availability in a given region or the use of chemicals and wet processing, for example, in our industry. Let's come to water pollution. So, because this is important, water pollution basically is defined as the presence in groundwater of toxic chemicals and biological agents that exceed what is naturally found in the water and may pose a threat to human health and or the environment. Additionally, water pollution may consist of chemicals introduced into the water bodies as a result of various human activities. So any amount of those chemicals pollutes the water, regardless of the harm they may pose to human health and the environment. And there's 3 types of water pollution. The first one is chemical. That means when various chemicals are the water pollution causes. In our industry, that's basically crude oil and or petroleum-based products like dye packages and dye stuff. Then there's radiological. That means when radioactive materials are the water pollutant causes, and there's so-called biological water pollution. This is when various microorganisms like bacterial species and viruses, worms, or algae occurring in a large number are the water pollution causes. This type of pollution is caused by decaying organic material in water, animal wastes, as well as improper disposal of human industry wastes, where obviously the fashion industry also contributes. So let's jump quickly on wastewater industry standards in the fashion scene or industry. This is a super complex topic. I could be talking about ages. Anyways, I wish to give a super short overview because I think this is very important. There's on one hand product standards, which define certain wastewater requirements, generally not on product level, but on site level. And normally they only apply to national wastewater regulations and not more. And then there's so-called site level wastewater standards, which in some cases define more strict wastewater management and residue requirements. And of course, there's also other wastewater guidelines from brands and industry consortia. But personally, I think the ZDHC, Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals Initiative, goes and works into the right direction, because I do believe that a uniform industry guideline would have many benefits, because currently we all know that the supply chain is confronted with multiple guidelines depending on which brand is sourcing the material, and brands are faced with the added task of like ensuring each vendor is complying with their own requirements. So there's a significant benefit to local communities and the environment from having a robust discharge guideline, which is should be followed across the industry. Next slide, please. Let's jump. I think I've got 2 minutes left. Super quickly on another excursion on cotton farming in our fashion industry. Because when we talk about water consumption in our industry, we always stumble on certain claims around cotton. And the reality, as was also already said during this webinar, is that we do not know how much water cotton actually consumes. We do not know anything, basically. Nevertheless, water consumption is not alone an indicator of irresponsible water management or environmental impact, again, without additional context about water availability in a given region. But what's more is, because at the end of the day, all plants and crops consume water. Singling out cotton as a high consumer of water can therefore be very misleading. So the way we commonly use data to talk about cotton's water consumption is false or misleading. And it's also misleading key context and a deeper level of understanding. But perhaps a more complete way to analyze cotton's water impact is not only to consider water use, water consumption, and or the water footprint, but the local water availability, the water stress and water risks where cotton is grown. And to fully grasp cotton's complex relationship to water, we have to start with the global water cycle. But this would go much too far. So I realized all of that during a project I led when I was working at Armed Angels. We founded an own organic farmers association in Gujarat, India, and supported more than 500 small-scale farming families, converting from conventional to organic cotton. And I do not yet know until today how much water the association is actually consuming. But what I know and saw is that while farming organically, there's no hazardous pesticides and fertilizers used in farming, which do not pollute groundwater streams. Next slide, Millie. There's only some nice emotional photos from India. So to finish my short presentation with some motivating words, what you as a brand can actually do. So you should check how far you are able to switch from preferably produced fibers, raw materials. You should work directly with the production sites and check how far they have responsible water management implemented. And you should definitely provide clear instructions to your consumers and your clients to reduce the amount of water and energy use while caring and cleaning the clothes. That's it for my part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. Fantastic, really helpful to understand from the farming perspective. And of course, you know, cotton, organic cotton, regenerative cotton is a rotational crop. It's grown, especially the smallholder farmers in India. So of course it's part of the fare of the of the farm. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to welcome Craig. Craig has a fantastic deck of some really beautiful slides. He promises me that he's going to rattle through them very, very quickly, although they're terribly beautiful. So over to you, Craig.
Thanks, Safia. Hi, I'm Craig. I'm the Research and Development Director at PANGAIA. I'm here to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what we focus on and a little bit of what we feel are problem-solving led innovations within this space. I come from a materials engineering background. I've spent most of my career in the sports engineering space, actually, and have pretty much been in a lot of the big sports brands. And my sell in terms of moving into sustainability context is I've shifted scopes, but I'm now in the space of marginal gains as it pertains to water, carbon, and everything else that gets encapsulated as part of a sustainability narrative. So it's not too much of a shift from where I've been before. Essentially, we're trying to shift everything forward and create change from my perspective, with innovation being the driver of that. Essentially, most people might know us as a fashion brand that is probably well known for bright coloured hoodies and sweatshirts. We're actually much more than that. We position ourselves as a material science company, where we're really creating and pushing the next generation of material innovation. And the goal is really to create and accelerate and inspire an earth positive future. We believe there are solves out there that are just not yet scalable. We feel that PANGAIA is a good vehicle to do that. So we do invest, we do create research projects and proposals, but ultimately our goal is to get that out there, tell a story, and make that really accessible to the people in the industry, really democratize this access to innovation. This is positioned in three ways. So I'm coming at from the science and innovation perspective. Our purpose, as I've kind of alluded to, is really around this earth positive future, and we have a fantastic impact team that leads a lot of that, where we have three big buckets that they're really targeting, which is climate action, biodiversity, and water health. And most specifically in water health, it's really measuring, analysing, and reducing our water footprint whilst improving water quality across our supply chain. And the design aspect is ultimately creating beautiful products in combination with the innovation and the purpose. Our philosophy is high-tech naturalism, which essentially is around taking abundance in nature, utilising new processes to make this accessible and falling into the laps of the consumer, essentially. Technology for us is always with the lens of having a responsible nature to it. We actually don't like to use the term sustainability. I think it's been overused and banded around too easily. So responsible innovation is the driver for us. But also acknowledging that in this space and in our industry, there are sometimes compromises to be made in order to shift the industry forward. We're certainly not perfect, and we don't feel that there's a silver bullet for every challenge we face in our industry right now. As I say, probably most well known for brightly coloured essentials, but we're spanning much broader than that. And on the next slide, you can see a little bit more in depth in terms of our research focus. So it's very broad, but we have teams spanning from polymer engineers, chemists, textile engineers, biomedical scientists. We're really kind of building a cohort of very broad backgrounds intentionally to cover this wide range of topics. So biodiversity, fossil-free, ethical sourcing, water health, of course, that we're here to discuss today, and ultimately waste reduction. As I say, they are big topics, and really spanning across that, of course, there's a need to test and validate these new solutions, give transparency into our supply chain. And ultimately, again, what we're trying to do here today is broadly educate both internally and externally as to what we feel are potential solves for some of these challenges. There's no easy answer and no easy way to address all of these. It's certainly a spectrum. There are things, as I said, that are perhaps potentially more accessible now, and some that will come in the future. So we like to put them into three different buckets, where evolution, again, is something that we're trying to move and adjust the needle in terms of what we have accessible to us right now. revolution being something that we can hopefully make an incremental change on, and then disruptive innovations where we feel that they are the next generation that is truly groundbreaking and creating industry change. And you'll see aspects of this as I run through the slides. This is a portfolio of technologies that we already have commercialized and available. In reference to Mark and Lavinia's slides, I think there are obviously hotspots that the industry is trying to address, and you can see aspects of that in here. So fiber, yes, of course, is a huge challenge. Our approach, as I mentioned earlier, is a biodiverse one where, okay, we do use cotton, but we're trying to diversify the fibers in that space. So sea fiber, fruit fiber, and plant fiber are good examples of that, where they are potential replacements for cotton, but are using either fast regenerating, fast growing plants such as the Himalayan nettle or bamboo, and fruit fiber we're using agricultural waste to be used in terms of a replacement for cotton. To address dyeing, I'll talk about that a little bit later, but our peppermint oil treatment is a microbial finish that is intended to elongate the time between washes. So essentially it's a odor, it's an anti-odor treatment for clothing that in principle stops you washing your garments as frequently. And these technologies are falling more into the disruption bucket. So I want to call out one that is colorifics that I'll come on to in another slide, but is the next generation of lab-grown dyes, which again is talking to this water health story and essentially a water footprint assessment that is associated with that. And a lot of the technologies here, anything from infinite fiber to fiber, or looking at either closed loop recycling systems for post-consumer recycling, should I say, recycling systems for garments, or biofabricated, which is essentially using nature's expertise to create the next generation of plant-based fibers. This is a technology that is patented by PANGAIA, but is not necessarily associated to water health, but is a plant-based alternative to goose or duck down. So again, just showing the breadth of technologies that we fall into. And colorifics is the one that I wanted to, or alluded to earlier, where we're working with a partner in the UK, a spin out from Cambridge University, where they're utilizing the benefits of microbes to essentially grow dye in a lab-based scenario, but are very much in scaling mode and are able to produce this at scale. We've launched a capsule collection with them, which, if you ask me, is absolutely incredible technology. As I say, power of microbes to ultimately replicate and reduce color for replacement of dye stuffs. Fiber I alluded to earlier, but again, a next generation fiber that is essentially lab grown. And on the next slide, you can see a printing ink example that is from carbon capture. Again, looking at a different scope, but again, purely focused on some of the emissions and some of the challenges we face in our industry and finding novel ways to utilize that. And then I'm conscious of time, but I'll talk about the CO2 example again for sunglasses. And on the final slide, which is very pertinent to this discussion, is a technology where we've partnered with a company called MCAX. And the intention here is to replace a lot of the harsh chemicals used in dye preparation. This also has the ability to function as a water repellent treatment without any chemicals. So it's utilizing, not the header on the slide here, apologies, that's a typo, but essentially it's a combination of plasma and laser treatment to create surface effects on fabric. So you're essentially changing the structure of a fabric to make it functional rather than using any kind of chemistry to do that. The image you can see on the left-hand side is a pre-treated fabric sample that obviously you can see a hairy and splintering nature to it. And through the use of this treatment, we're able to smooth the fibers and in principle create a reduction in microfiber shedding. This is also very much experimental. We actually won the Microfiber Innovation Challenge as part of this proposal. And it's something that, again, could in principle be a huge industry change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant overview, Craig. We had some really interesting questions in. Giovanni has asked, where can they find studies or reports to understand how to proceed on the road to zero pollution. The theory is clear, but there isn't enough information about the practice. Could I ask, please, just 30-40 seconds of advice from each panelist? Could I please ask Craig, if you wouldn't mind starting?
Yes, certainly. I guess, unfortunately, no easy answer. I think do your research and understand exactly what you're trying to cover. Of course, applying to zero depends on the inputs and what you're trying to create, but yeah, dive into the detail as much as you can. I mean, we've run LCAs and a lot of our product. I'm not expecting everybody to have that ability to do that and dive into what is ultimately a bit of cost, but yeah, research, dive into the detail as much as you can.
Great. Lavinia, from you, what advice would you give?
Yes, from me, I think there's no real good wastewater guidelines out there, at least for the moment, which can be applied on an industry-wide level other than ZDHC. And I totally agree with Maddy. I was also very confused at the beginning, like 10 years ago, and like I didn't like the aggressive movement they started, but they have developed to become a pretty good ally and initiative in our industry.
ZDHC is a very, very good place to start.
Yeah, and they've got a wastewater guideline for suppliers also for brands with like really like the basics explained, what to do, first step, second step, third step.
Marvelous, thank you. That's really useful to hear. Mark, where would you recommend brands start their journey?
Talk to your suppliers. You'll find that there's a huge mass of information and knowledge and expertise with the supply base, and often what tends to happen is the brands ignore that, don't reward it, and therefore it doesn't get implemented. So definitely talk to your suppliers, but then also talk to other brands and retailers. That in this space there is an awful lot of collaboration going on, and you know, huge networks, ZDHC, there is NRDC, there's Textiles 20. There's loads of acronyms, by the way, as well. So work your way through the acronyms. But absolutely, talk to the suppliers. They will have a very clear idea about what they could do, what they should be doing, and need your partnership to be able to do that.
And it is that partnering, isn't it? I remember with manufacturers that we worked with in southern India. You know, if you are working in deep partnership, it's you know, it's being able to support their initiatives and ideas. They're often very, very keen. I remember when they wanted to go reverse osmosis 15 years ago, and you know, so you can be part of that process when you're working closely. Maddy, any comments from you as to where you might suggest that brands start the journey? I mean, obviously you've suggested some great resources in your presentation too.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say quickly, designers have a key role in selecting and making clothes that last as a first point. But to follow up on hazardous chemicals, look at our report Destination Zero Annex 1, and there's a diagram there of how to detox, and it covers all the elements from the chemical inventory, where to take the sample, which is extremely important. If you take it after the wastewater treatment, all you're doing is just saying how effective the treatment plant is. You're not seeing what the factory is using, and that's the point of the wastewater testing, is to inform the factory, well, you're using this chemical, can we find an alternative? And this is where sometimes ZDHC isn't quite as clear, because they categorize their chemicals differently, like heavy metals are conventional and the other hazardous chemicals are not. But you go pre-wastewater testing, use the most stringent limits, and that way you find out if there's a problem. And we've even picked that up with our own suppliers, where they've tested clear for several years, and then something comes up and they've had to look at it and they said, oh yes, that's because of X, Y, Z, and that something had changed, and then they can address it. And if we weren't testing, we wouldn't know. So yes, have a look at that diagram and the explanation underneath.
Just to add, if I can, Safia, I would just to what the team's already said, ZDHD, microfiber I think's been mentioned, but Textile Exchange and Ellen MacArthur Foundation are also great resources.
Thank you. Yes, and please do also have a look at the webinar number 6, which is low impact materials. There are some crossovers, obviously, with what we've been discussing today. And just to move on, so we've been talking. We're beginning to look at the scope of the topic around water and pollution, and I'm deeply indebted to our speakers who have shared their expertise with us today. This will be available on YouTube, and please do watch it, share it, go back over the presentations, and there's lots of links and useful references there. There are other webinars that are coming up with Fashion Declares. There's an opportunity around volunteering at Fashion Declares, also looking at how Fashion Declares can support you with different areas of know-how and how to over those 7 different tools of the 5 goals and commitments. We also have a webinar on fashion communications in the climate, ecological and social emergency, and then in September we'll be running a webinar on the circular economy, and then also on governance, transparency and accountability in October. So if you've not joined the community yet, please join up so that you don't miss any of these amazing webinars and resources. I know some of you are new to the webinar series, so please do follow us also on Twitter, LinkedIn and Instagram. And we'll look forward to staying in touch. A big thank you to the excellent presentations from Maddy, Craig, Lavinia and Mark. Thank you so very much for joining us. And thank you very much for being a brilliant audience and all your great questions. We'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.